letter came back with a single red stamp across the front. Rejected. Insufficient credentials for the position. Camille Osei had expected it. She had applied anyway. She set the envelope on the kitchen counter, next to a half-eaten sleeve of crackers and a cold cup of coffee she had made at 5:30 that morning before her shift at the loading dock. The coffee had been hot once. She had not had time to drink it. She had an hour between the end of her shift and the start of her daughter's school drop-off, and in that hour she had answered 14 emails, ironed a blouse she had bought second-hand from a church sale, and printed the rejection letter that had arrived in her inbox at 2047 a.m. She had been awake at 2047 a.m. She was usually awake at 2047 a.m. Her daughter Zoe was 7 years old and ate cereal dry because they had run out of milk. She did not complain. She sat at the kitchen table with her feet swinging and asked her mother why the letter had a red stamp on it. Because someone made a mistake, Camille said. What kind of mistake? The kind you fix, Camille said. Come on, put your shoes on. To understand what happened 6 months later in that conference room on the 14th floor of Drexler and Holst Financial Group, you need to understand what Camille Osei had been doing for the 3 years before it. She was 29 years old. She had grown up in East Cleveland in a 2-bedroom apartment with her mother, her grandmother, and at various points, 3 cousins whose parents were going through things. Her mother cleaned hotel rooms at the Marriott on Euclid Avenue. Her grandmother made the best jollof rice in the county and kept a notebook of every dollar that came in and every dollar that went out, down to the last quarter, because she had grown up in a world where not knowing where your money went meant you went with it. Camille had learned to read financial statements from that notebook. She had not gone to college the normal way. She had started at Cuyahoga Community College at 19 while working mornings at a pharmacy and evenings at a grocery, taking 2 classes a semester and finishing her associate degree in 4 years instead of 2. She had then transferred to Cleveland State on a partial scholarship and finished a degree in finance while working the loading dock job that paid $12 an hour more than anything else available at 4 a.m. She had graduated with honors. No one from Drexler and Holst had attended the ceremony. No one from Drexler and Holst knew she existed. She had applied for the junior analyst position 3 separate times in 2 years. Each time, the rejection letter came back within a week. Insufficient credentials, position filled, seeking candidates with advanced degrees from accredited institutions. The 3rd rejection was the one she had expected. The 4th application, she did differently. She did not apply through the portal. 6 months before that conference room moment, Camille had attended a public financial symposium at the Cleveland Convention Center. It was free. She had found it on a flyer at the library. She had worn the second-hand blouse and carried a legal pad because she could not afford the notebooks they sold at the registration table. The keynote speaker was a woman named Dr. Pauline Achterberg, a forensic economist who had spent 20 years identifying fraud patterns in mid-sized corporate portfolios. Camille had read 2 of her published papers the night before on the library computer. She had filled 4 pages of her legal pad with notes. After the keynote, during the networking portion that Camille had technically not paid for access to, she had stood in the corner with a cup of free coffee and opened her legal pad and started working through a problem that had been in the back of her mind for 6 weeks. She had noticed something in Drexler and Holt's publicly available quarterly reports. Not something dramatic, something small. A pattern in the variance figures across 3 consecutive quarters that did not match the stated acquisition strategy. It was the kind of thing you would not see unless you were looking for it. The kind of thing you would not look for unless you had read a particular chapter in a forensic accounting textbook that most finance programs did not assign because it was considered advanced elective material. Camille had found that chapter in a donated textbook on the free shelf at the Cuyahoga Library. She had been 22. She had read it 4 times. She was standing in the corner of the convention center working through her notes when Dr. Achterberg walked past on her way to the exit and saw the legal pad. She stopped. She looked at the page. She looked at Camille. "What are you doing?" "Working through something I noticed in a company's public filings," Camille said. She said the name of the company. Dr. Achterberg looked at the page again. She pulled out her glasses. She stood there for 11 minutes. Camille counted later from memory. She stood there and she read every notation on the page and did not say anything for 11 minutes. Then she said, "Who taught you to read variance this way?" A library book, Camille said. Dr. Octobird looked at her for a moment. Come find me before you leave, she said. I want to finish this conversation. Drexler and Holst Financial Group had been in operation for 31 years. It occupied the top 3 floors of a tower on East 9th Street and managed portfolios for 47 corporate clients across 7 states. The managing partner was a man named Conrad Voss. He was 61 years old. He had gone to Wharton. His name was on the glass door at the building entrance alongside the firm's founding partner, who had died in 2009 and whose photograph still hung in the main lobby because Conrad felt it added gravitas. Conrad had hired the same type of analyst for 20 years, the type who came from Wharton or Kellogg or Ross, who wore certain shoes, who knew how to talk about certain things at the right kind of dinners. He had a system. The system had worked. He was comfortable with the system. When the 4th application from Camille Osei arrived on his desk, it did not come through the portal. It came with a cover letter. The cover letter was 1 page. It did not talk about her passion for finance. It did not list her personal strengths or call herself a team player. It described, in precise technical language, a discrepancy in Drexler and Holst's public quarterly variance reporting across Q1 through Q3 of the prior year. It named the specific figures. It explained what the discrepancy suggested. It offered 2 possible interpretations, only one of which reflected well on the firm. At the bottom of the letter was a single line. I would be glad to discuss this in person at your convenience. It was not a threat. It was quieter than a threat. It was a door left open just slightly, in a way that made you want to know what was on the other side. Conrad Voss read the letter twice. He called his head of compliance, a man named Garrett, into his office. Garrett read the letter. He did not speak for a moment. She's either wrong, Conrad said, or she's very right. Garrett looked at the figures the letter cited. He pulled up the relevant filings on his laptop. The color in his face changed in a way that Conrad noticed and did not comment on. Set up a meeting, Conrad said. Camille got the call on a Tuesday. She was at the loading dock. She stepped outside into the cold to take it, standing between 2 parked trucks with the phone pressed to her ear, and when the assistant told her that Mr. Voss would like to schedule a meeting at her earliest convenience, she said Thursday at 10 works for me, thank you very much, and hung up. She stood between the trucks for a moment. Then she went back inside and finished her shift. She did not tell her mother that night. She did not tell anyone. She sat at the kitchen table after Zoe was in bed and went through her notes again, page by page, and then she closed the legal pad and made a cup of tea and sat with it until it went cold the way the coffee always went cold. She was not nervous. She was something else. The feeling you have when you have been carrying a heavy thing for a very long time and you can see the place where you are going to be able to set it down. She went to bed at midnight. She was up at 4. She made Zoe's lunch and put a note in the bag the way her own mother had put notes in hers. The note said, "You are the best thing I ever did. Have a good day." Then she went to work. On Thursday morning, Camille Osei walked into the lobby of the Drexler and Holst Tower at 9:52 a.m. She was wearing the second-hand blouse and a blazer she had borrowed from a woman at her church who was roughly the same size. She carried her legal pad in a folder she had bought for $2 at a dollar store because it looked more professional than carrying the legal pad alone. The receptionist looked at her, looked at a screen, and looked at her again. "She has an appointment," said a voice. Dr. Octobird was standing at the elevator. Camille had not known she would be there. Dr. Octobird had mentioned 6 months ago at the convention center that she sometimes consulted with mid-sized firms on variance analysis. She had not mentioned that she consulted with this firm. She nodded at Camille once, the way someone nods when a calculation they ran in their head turns out to be correct. They rode the elevator to the 14th floor together. Conrad Voss's office had a view of the lake. He was standing when they came in, which was the kind of small thing that tells you something about a person. He shook Camille's hand. He shook Dr. Octobird's hand. He gestured to the chairs. Garrett was already seated. There were 2 other men in the room whom Camille did not recognize. She noted them and moved on. "You found something in our filings," Conrad said. He was not the kind of man who spent a long time on preamble. "I noticed a pattern," Camille said. She opened the folder. She placed her notes on the table. She had rewritten them 3 times in the past week, not to change the analysis, but to make it as clean and as precise as a person's handwriting could be without a printer. The kind of handwriting you develop when you have been told your whole life that your work has to be perfectly legible to be taken seriously. She walked them through it. She did not use qualifiers. She did not say, "I think," or "it seems like," or "you might want to consider." She stated what she had found. She stated what it meant. She offered, as she had in the letter, 2 interpretations. The first interpretation was a structural reporting error that had been compounding across 3 quarters, likely originating in how a particular class of acquisition cost was being categorized. Fixable, embarrassing, but fixable. The second interpretation was worse, and she laid it out with the same flat precision. Because as she softened it, she would be doing them no favor, and she was not here to do them a favor. She was here to be accurate. When she finished, the room was quiet. Garrett was looking at his laptop. He had been cross-checking her figures as she talked. He had stopped typing. He was just looking at the screen. One of the men she did not recognize leaned forward. "Where did you study forensic accounting?" "A textbook," Camille said. "Cuyahoga Community College, Cleveland State, and a textbook." The man sat back. Conrad looked at the legal pad. He looked at Camille. He looked at Dr. Achterberg. Dr. Achterberg had not said a word since they sat down. She had her hands folded on the table, and she was watching Conrad's face. Conrad picked up the legal pad. He read the first page. He turned it. He read the second page. He set it down. "This is the first interpretation," he said. "The error, not the other one." "Yes," Camille said. "You're sure?" "As sure as the figures allow. If your internal records show something different, the analysis would change, but based on the public data, yes." Conrad was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "And you applied for the junior analyst position?" "4 times," Camille said. Garrett looked up from his laptop. Conrad leaned back in his chair. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. He was not a man who showed much on his face, but something moved across it briefly, something she would not have been able to name but recognized. "Why did you keep applying?" "Because I was right for the job," Camille said, "and because you needed someone who could do this." She touched the edge of the legal pad lightly. The room was quiet again. Then Conrad said something she had not expected. He said, "Garrett, pull up the Meridian accounts." Garrett looked at him. "Pull them up," Conrad said. "I want her to look at something. Now I want to stop here for a moment. Because what we are watching in that room is not just a job interview. It is the thing that happens when someone who has been told 4 separate times that they are not what a room like this requires walks into that room anyway, with a legal pad and a borrowed blazer and a cup of cold coffee somewhere behind her in a kitchen in East Cleveland. There is a version of the story where the rejection letters were the end of it. Most versions of this story end there. The letter comes back with the red stamp, and the person folds it and puts it in a drawer, and that is that. Camille Osei did not put it in a drawer. She went to a free symposium with a legal pad, and she stood in a corner and she worked. That is the whole difference. That is the entire distance between the drawer and the 14th floor. The Meridian accounts were a corporate portfolio that Drexler and Holst had managed for 9 years. They were, on the surface, straightforward. They had been reviewed annually. Nothing unusual had ever been flagged. Camille looked at the summary Garrett put on the screen. She looked at it for approximately 90 seconds. Then she said, "Can I see the Q2 breakdowns from 2021 and 2022 side by side?" Garrett looked at Conrad. Conrad nodded. Garrett pulled them up. Camille leaned forward. She looked at the 2 columns. She looked at one specific line item in each column, and then she looked at the aggregate below it. She picked up a pen. "May I?" Garrett pushed a notepad toward her. She wrote 3 numbers. She showed them to Conrad. "The middle figure here," she said, "the way it's allocated across these 2 years suggests the cost basis for a specific class of asset was reset at some point between the 2 reporting periods without a corresponding disclosure. That's not necessarily wrong, but it would need documentation. If the documentation exists, it's fine. If it doesn't, you have a different problem than the one I came here to talk about." Garrett had gone very still. Conrad looked at the 3 numbers. He looked at Garrett. Garrett said, "I'll need to check the internal records." Conrad said, "Do that." He turned back to Camille. He looked at her for a long moment. Not the way he had looked at her when she walked in, which had been polite and neutral, the way you look at someone before you know what they are. This was different. "How long did it take you to see that?" he said. She thought about it honestly. 90 seconds, she said. Maybe less. The two columns were next to each other, so it was faster than it would normally be. Conrad said nothing. Dr. Octerbird, who had still not spoken, made a very small sound. It was not a laugh and not quite a smile. It was the sound of a person who has known something for 6 months and has just watched someone else figure it out in 90 seconds. The meeting lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. Camille had expected 45 minutes. At the end of it, Conrad Voss stood up. He thanked her for her time. He said he would be in touch. She shook his hand, and Dr. Octerbird's hand, and Garrett's hand, and the hands of the two men she still did not know the names of. She took her legal pad and her folder and she walked to the elevator. She rode down 14 floors alone. She walked through the lobby. She nodded to the receptionist, who nodded back this time without the double look. She walked out onto East 9th Street into the cold. She stood there for a moment. Then she called her mother. Her mother picked up on the second ring the way she always did, because her mother was the kind of person who always picked up. "Mama," she said, "I think something happened." Her mother said, "Good or bad?" Camille watched a cab go by. "Good," she said, "I think good." Her mother did not say congratulations. She did not say, "I told you so." She said, "Come for dinner tonight. I'll make rice." That was all. That was everything. The offer letter came 8 days later. It was not for the junior analyst position she had applied for 4 times. It was for a senior analyst role. It included a salary that was more than Camille had made in the previous 2 years combined. It included benefits. It included a line at the bottom that said the firm would support her enrollment in a graduate certification program if she chose to pursue one. She read the letter 3 times at the kitchen table. Zoe was eating dry cereal across from her, feet swinging. "Mama," Zoe said, "is that a good letter?" Camille set it down. "Yeah, baby," she said. "That's a good letter." "What does it say?" She thought about how to put it. "It says someone finally stopped making a mistake," she said. Zoe considered this. "Is it the same mistake as before?" Camille looked at her daughter. She looked at the letter. She looked at the cold coffee at the edge of the table. "A version of it," she said, "but not anymore." What happened after that took time, the way real things do. The documentation Garrett checked did not, as it turned out, exist for the Meridian accounts. That became a separate matter involving the firm's compliance department and, eventually, a third-party audit that Camille was not directly part of, but whose findings she had, without knowing it, set in motion. The client was notified. Corrections were made. No one used the word fraud in any document she was ever shown, but the implications of that absence were themselves a kind of statement. Garrett resigned 3 months later, citing personal reasons. Conrad Voss sent her an email the day after Garrett's resignation. It said, "Good catch, keep doing that." She printed it and put it in the folder from the dollar store. She still has that folder. The loading dock job ended on a Friday. She gave 2 weeks' notice even though she didn't have to. She brought donuts on her last day because that was the thing you did, and because the people there had been kind to her in the ways that matter. The small daily ways, covering shifts and never asking questions about where she was going in the blazer that one Thursday. She started at Drexler and Holst on a Monday. She took the bus. She was early. She sat in the lobby for 6 minutes before anyone came to bring her up. She looked at the photograph of the founding partner on the wall. She looked at the glass door with the name Voss on it. She thought about the first rejection letter, and the second and the third and the fourth, and the red stamps and the phrase insufficient credentials that had appeared in each of them. She thought about her grandmother's notebook. Every dollar in, every dollar out. The accounting of a life lived carefully in a world that did not make carefulness easy. She thought about Zoe eating dry cereal with her feet swinging. Then the elevator opened, and a young man from HR came out with a badge and a lanyard and a welcome to the team smile, and she stood up and shook his hand and went upstairs. On the day she was named lead analyst for the firm's regional portfolio division, 18 months after walking in with a borrowed blazer and a legal pad, Conrad Voss called her into his office. He was standing again. He did that. He slid a folder across the desk. She looked at it. That was the fourth application, he said, the one with the letter. He had kept it. It was in a sleeve protector now. She did not know what to say, so she did not say anything. He said, I've been doing this for 30 years. I have hired 112 analysts. He paused. I did not see it before you made me look. She understood what it cost him to say that. She did not make it larger than it was. I'm glad you looked, she said. He nodded once. He picked up the folder and put it back in his desk drawer. She walked out. She called her mother from the elevator. Her mother picked up on the second ring. Mama, she said, Aunt Abbott again. Good or bad? The elevator opened on the lobby. She walked through it, past the photograph, past the glass door, out onto East 9th Street. Good, she said. Same as before. Good. Her mother said, come for dinner. I'll make rice. Camille Osei stood on the street in the November cold with the phone pressed to her ear. She thought about a little girl at a kitchen table in East Cleveland counting a grandmother's dollars. She thought about the free shelf at the Cuyahoga Library, and the textbook no one had assigned, and the chapter that changed the shape of the way she saw numbers. She thought about Zoe, who that morning had finally asked for milk in her cereal because there was money for milk now, and who had looked up from the bowl and said, Mama, this is better. Camille told her mother yes. She started walking toward the bus stop. Not because she had to, because the bus was how she got around in this city, the city that had made her, the same way the loading dock and the free library and the church lady's blazer had all made her, and she was not going to pretend otherwise now that someone had finally stopped making the mistake of not seeing her clearly. She had always been exactly what she was. The room just needed time to catch up. I keep thinking about the cold coffee. Not the conference room on the 14th floor, not the offer letter, not even the moment Camille stood on East 9th Street and called her mother. I keep coming back to that cup of coffee she made at 5:30 in the morning, that she never had time to drink, because that's where the story actually lives, not in the dramatic moments, in the ordinary ones nobody sees. Camille didn't walk into Drexler and Holst because she got lucky. She walked in because of 10 years of cold coffee and dry cereal and double shifts and library shelves that nobody monitored. Every single thing that looked like a disadvantage had quietly become a form of preparation. That's the part that stays with me. The way the system kept telling her no, and she kept treating each no as information rather than verdict. There's something I'd come to believe about the way outcomes actually work, not in a mystical sense, but in a plain human sense. What you do when nobody is watching tends to show up later in rooms full of people who are watching. Camille read that forensic accounting textbook at 22 because she was curious, not because she knew it would matter. She worked through those variance figures at a free symposium in a corner by herself because she couldn't stop thinking about them, not because she had a plan. And then one day Conrad Boss slid a portfolio across a table and she saw the answer in 90 seconds, because that's what 10 years of quiet, unglamorous intellectual honesty looks like when it finally gets a surface to land on. That's the thing about real competence. It doesn't perform. It just sits there, ready, until the moment requires it. What gets me about her character, and I mean this in the deepest sense, not the complimentary sense, is that she never let the bitterness of being overlooked turn into smallness. 4 rejection letters, 4 red stamps, and she never took the shortcut of becoming cynical about it. Never decided the game was rigged, so why bother playing it straight? She kept her work clean. She kept her analysis honest. When she sat in that conference room, she laid out both interpretations, including the one that was worse for them, because accuracy mattered more to her than making a good impression. That is a form of integrity that most people abandon the first time it costs them something. And then there's the persistence. Not the loud kind. Not the kind that announces itself. The kind that looks like a woman getting up at 4 in the morning and making her kids lunch and going to a job that pays $12 an hour more than anything else available at that hour, and then going home and reading a library book before bed. That kind of persistence is invisible until it isn't. Until someone slides a folder across a desk and asks you to look at something, and you look, and you see it in 90 seconds, and the room goes quiet. Zoe asked her mother if it was a good letter. Camille said someone finally stopped making a mistake. I think about that answer a lot, because the mistake was never really about Camille. The mistake was a failure of imagination on the part of people who had decided, before looking, what a person like her could or couldn't hold. The room just needed time to catch up. That's the whole lesson, if there is one. Do the work with enough integrity that when the room finally does look, there's nothing to hide and everything to show. And trust that the cold coffee and the borrowed blazer and the legal pad and the $2 folder from the dollar store are all part of something that will eventually make sense to someone who matters. It made sense to Conrad Voss on a Thursday at 9:52 a.m. It'll make sense to somebody for you too.